Millionaire tried to humiliate his ex on his wedding day, but when she showed up with 4 children identical to him, everything changed. The most luxurious reception hall in New York was impeccably decorated for what promised to be the wedding of the year. Richard Morrison, CEO of Morrison Group and one of the most powerful men in America, adjusted his tie in front of the mirror while his personal assistant checked the last details of the ceremony. A smile of satisfaction crossed his face when he picked up the golden envelope on the table, the special invitation he had personally delivered to Natalie Carson. "Are you sure you want to do this, Richard?" asked Henry, his longtime friend and company lawyer. "Absolutely. I want her to see with her own eyes everything she lost when she abandoned me. I want Natalie to know that while she disappeared without a trace, I built an empire and found someone worthy of me," he replied with a calculated coldness that masked years of resentment. The story between Richard and Natalie had begun 10 years earlier, when he was still just the ambitious son of Augustus Morrison, trying to prove his worth in the family construction company. Natalie, daughter of a teacher from a small town in Virginia, had come to New York to study architecture at NYU and became an intern at the company. What began as a simple attraction quickly transformed into an intense romance. For almost 2 years, they lived a love story that seemed perfect until the day she disappeared without explanation. "Sir, can you confirm if all guests have RSVP'd?" asked Marcus, his personal assistant. "Did Natalie Carson confirm?" Richard questioned, ignoring the original question. "Yes, sir. The team received confirmation yesterday," replied the assistant, visibly uncomfortable. Richard smiled again. His plan was in motion. In a few hours, he would be married to Fiona Whitmore, heiress to a powerful hotel chain and the woman his father had always considered ideal for him. The Morrison Empire would unite with the Whitmore Empire, creating one of the greatest business forces in the country. And Natalie would be there, witnessing the moment when Richard finally left the past behind. What he didn't know was that this night would change his life in ways he could never imagine. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. As the first guests began to arrive, Mrs. Elizabeth, Richard's mother, sat discreetly in a corner of the hall, observing her son with an expression that mixed pride and concern. She had never approved of her son's relationship with Natalie, but she also never fully understood the circumstances of the breakup. Augustus Morrison always said the girl had accepted money to disappear, but something in Natalie's eyes, whenever her son's name was mentioned, made Elizabeth doubt this version. "Mom, are you okay?" Richard approached, noticing his mother's worried expression. "I am, son. Just thinking about how proud your father would be of this moment," she lied, averting her gaze. Augustus had passed away just over a year ago, a victim of cardiac complications, but his legacy and influence still hung over the family. "Dad always wanted this marriage. I'm finally fulfilling his last wish," Richard replied, not noticing the shadow that crossed his mother's eyes. On the other side of the city, in a modest apartment in Brooklyn, Natalie took a deep breath as she finished adjusting Lucas's bow tie, one of the 4 identical boys bustling around her. Julian, Jake, and Matthew, already properly dressed, were running around the living room, excited about the idea of attending a fancy party, as they had called it. "Mom, why do we need to go to this party? We don't even know this man," asked Matthew, the most observant of the 4. Natalie felt her heart tighten. How could she explain to 9-year-old children that they were about to meet the father who never knew of their existence? How could she say that this moment, which she had avoided for so long, had finally arrived because of an invitation laden with revenge? "You're going to meet important people from your family," she replied, opting for a half-truth. "Remember what we talked about. Behave well and stay close to me." "Aunt Lisa said we're going to meet our father," Jake commented innocently. "Is that true, Mum?" Natalie shot a disapproving look at her younger sister, who was helping her finish, getting ready. "They needed to know," Lisa defended herself. "You can't just take them to a wedding without preparing them." "I was going to tell them on the way," Natalie replied, trying to control the anxiety growing in her chest. "And yes, boys, you're going to meet your father today, but I don't know how he'll react, so I need you to be strong, okay?" The four boys, with their green eyes identical to Richard's and the same wavy brown hair, solemnly nodded. From a very young age, they had learned to be each other's support and their mother's backbone, who always worked tirelessly to give them everything they needed. "Are you sure you want to do this, Natalie?" asked Lisa, while helping her sister put on the pearl necklace, the only valuable item that remained from the time she dated Richard. "No, I'm not sure. But after receiving that invitation, I realized I can't postpone it any longer. Richard has the right to know he's a father, and the boys have the right to know their father, even if he doesn't want them in his life." The rideshare driver arrived, and Natalie gathered courage to face what would undoubtedly be the most difficult moment of her life since the day she discovered she was pregnant, and that she no longer had any way to contact Richard. Back at the hall, the ceremony was about to begin. Fiona, stunning in her haute couture dress, waited in the bride's private room. Richard, positioned at the improvised altar, greeted guests while his eyes occasionally darted to the entrance of the hall. "She hasn't arrived yet," Henry informed, noticing his friend's restlessness. "Are you sure this is a good idea? You're about to get married, Richard. Maybe it's better to truly leave the past behind." "I need to see her face when she realizes everything she lost," insisted Richard, adjusting his cuffs. "After that, I can move forward completely." The hall was filled with America's business elite, politicians, entrepreneurs, celebrities. Everyone wanted to witness the union that would create one of the largest economic groups in the country. The tables were impeccably decorated with arrangements of white orchids, French champagne was served in crystal flutes, and a small orchestra played classical music, creating an atmosphere of sophistication and exclusivity. Edward Carter, the E. Morrison Group's financial director and Richard's close friend, approached discreetly. "There's something we need to discuss before the ceremony," he said quietly. "We've discovered some irregularities in the contracts for the Boston branch." "Not today, Edward," Richard cut him off. "No business. Today is about celebration," and his voice trailed off when his eyes caught movement at the entrance of the hall. Natalie had arrived, but she wasn't alone. Time seemed to freeze. The buzz of conversations gradually diminished until it transformed into a deafening silence. All eyes turned to the elegant woman walking slowly down the central aisle, accompanied by four perfectly identical boys, all wearing dark suits with matching bow ties. Richard felt his legs weaken. His vision narrowed, focusing only on the four childish faces that, even from a distance, were unmistakably similar to his own face as a child. The same slightly upturned nose, the same penetrating green eyes, the same wavy brown hair. "My God," whispered Elizabeth Morrison, rising from her chair with trembling hands covering her mouth. "These are the grandchildren they never allowed me to know." Mrs. Elizabeth's statement, though quiet, was heard by several nearby guests who immediately began to whisper. The news spread through the hall like wildfire. "Richard has children. The ex-girlfriend brought his children. They're quadruplets." Fiona, who had chosen that moment to make her triumphant entrance, stopped abruptly upon noticing the commotion. When her eyes found the four boys next to Natalie, the color drained from her face. Her father, Robert Whitmore, immediately approached, holding her by the arm. "What does this mean?" he asked loudly, addressing Richard, but staring fixedly at Natalie and the children. Richard couldn't respond. His eyes were locked with Natalie's, who stared back with a mixture of defiance and apprehension. She hadn't planned to create a scene. Her intention was to wait until the end of the ceremony and approach Richard privately. But upon entering the hall, all eyes turned to her and the boys, and now it was too late to back down. Partially regaining his composure, Richard approached Natalie with slow, uncertain steps. What does this mean?" he asked, his voice almost unrecognizable. "It means you have 4 sons," replied Natalie, keeping her voice firm despite the tremor. In her hands. "Boys, this is your father, Richard Morrison." The 4 boys looked at the man before them with varying degrees of curiosity and apprehension. It was Lucas, always the most fearless, who stepped forward. "Why have you never visited us?" he asked. Directly, his green eyes, identical to Richard's, shining with a mixture of curiosity and hurt. The innocent question, laden with pain, hit Richard like a physical blow. He knelt down, coming to the boy's height. not caring about the scandalized looks from the guests or Fiona's wedding dress, which was moving further away, supported by her father. I didn't know you existed, he answered honestly, his voice thick with emotion. He turned to Natalie, his eyes full of questions. Why did you never tell me? Because you disappeared, she replied, years of hurt overflowing. Because when I found out I was pregnant, you had vanished without a trace. Your phone was disconnected, you had moved, and nobody at the company would tell me where you were, or pretended not to know. What are you talking about? You're the one who disappeared. You accepted money from my father to leave me, exclaimed Richard, standing up. The shock was visible on Natalie's face. Your father told you that I accepted money. Richard, your father fired me when he found out we were together. He said you had gone to London, that you didn't want to see me anymore, and that I should disappear. I tried to contact you for months. The tension in the hall was palpable. Guests watched the scene as if it were a live soap opera. Fiona, recovering part of her composure, approached again. Richard, what's going on? Who are these children? She asked, her voice oscillating between anger and despair. Before Richard could answer, Elizabeth stepped forward. They're his children, Fiona, my grandchildren, the grandchildren my husband and I hid from him for all these years. Elizabeth's confession provoked a new wave of murmurs among the guests. Richard looked at his mother, stunned. Mom, you knew? Not from the beginning, Elizabeth replied, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. I found out when the boys were about 3 years old. Your father had hired an investigator to monitor Natalie, wanted to make sure she wouldn't return to disturb his plans for you. When he found out she had your children, he increased the surveillance, but forbade me from telling you. Why? Asked Richard, his voice almost disappearing. Because he had plans for you, son. Plans that included the marriage to Fiona and the union of the Morrison and Whitmore empires. A scandal with an ex-girlfriend and children out of wedlock wasn't part of those plans. Richard felt the world spin. Everything he believed to be true about his past, about Natalie, about the end of their relationship, was an elaborate lie orchestrated by his own father. And his mother, although she had discovered part of the truth, had remained silent. You let me believe she had abandoned me for money, Richard accused, looking at his mother with disappointment. You let me build my life on a lie. Your father was a powerful and relentless man, Richard. He controlled everything and everyone around him, including me. When I finally had the courage to confront him, he threatened to completely separate me from you. I was afraid. Elizabeth's voice failed. Natalie, realizing the situation was getting out of control, tried to retreat with the boys. We didn't come to ruin your wedding, Richard. I just thought you needed to know. We can talk another time. No, he exclaimed, grabbing her by the arm. I'm not going to let you walk out of my life again, not now that I know the truth. Robert Whitmore, Fiona's father, intervened. This is absurd. We're in the middle of a wedding ceremony. A ceremony based on lies, replied Richard, without taking his eyes off his children, who were watching. Everything with confused and frightened expressions. Fiona, feeling humiliated and betrayed, ripped off her veil and threw it on the floor. It's over, Richard. I'm not going to marry a man who has an entire hidden family. Fiona, please. Richard tried, turning to her. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. It doesn't matter, she replied dryly. What matters is that now everyone knows, and I'm not going to be the one who accepts another woman's leftovers, especially with 4 children involved. With these words, Fiona dramatically left the hall, followed by her father and several Whitmore family guests. Other guests, feeling the weight of the moment and the awkwardness of the situation, began to discreetly withdraw. In a matter of minutes, the luxurious hall that should have witnessed the union of 2 business empires was practically empty, except for the stunned employees, some of Richard's closer friends, his mother, and of course Natalie and the 4 boys. I think we need to talk, Richard finally said, facing Natalie. But not here. Let's go to my house. I don't know if that's a good idea, hesitated Natalie, looking at her sons. The boys are tired and confused. Maybe we should leave it for tomorrow. Please, insisted Richard, his voice laden with emotion. I've waited 10 years to know the truth. I can't wait another day. Natalie looked at her children, who were now observing their father with a mixture of fascination and wariness. After a moment of silence, she nodded. "All right, but we won't stay long, and I want my sister to come with us." Lisa, who had remained discreetly beside her nephews during the entire episode, stepped forward. "I'm not going to leave my sister and my nephews alone with you after everything that's happened." Richard agreed with a nod. He was willing to accept any condition, as long as he could spend more time with Natalie and his children. While Henry took charge of dealing with the last guests and resolving the practical issues of the cancelled wedding, Richard escorted Natalie, Lisa, and the boys to his limousine. Elizabeth followed them, still visibly shaken. "You're coming too." "Mom?" asked Richard coldly. "I need to explain everything, son, please." With a sigh, Richard allowed his mother to enter the vehicle as well. The journey to the Morrison mansion in the Hamptons was made in a tense silence, broken only by the occasional excited whispers of the boys, impressed with the luxury of the limousine and the unexpected adventure they found themselves in. Upon arriving at the mansion, the four boys' eyes widened at the magnitude of the property. The vast illuminated garden, the central fountain, the imposing neoclassical facade, everything contrasted drastically with the modest Brooklyn apartment where they had grown up. "Your house is a castle," exclaimed Julian, the most expressive of the brothers. "It's too big for just one person," commented Jake, always practical. Richard felt a pang of sadness as he realized how much he had missed. 10 years of life with his sons, 10 years of moments like this, 10 years he could never recover. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. Once inside the mansion, Richard led everyone to the main living room. It was an elegant but cold environment, decorated with expensive artwork and designer furniture, without any element suggesting coziness or familiarity. "Would you like something to drink? Or perhaps the boys would like a snack," he offered, suddenly aware of his role as host and father. "Juice for the boys would be good," replied Natalie, "and something stronger for me if you have it." Richard nodded and asked one of the housekeepers to bring juice for the children, whiskey for him and Natalie, and tea for Elizabeth and Lisa. When everyone was settled, there was an awkward moment of silence. "What are your names?" Richard finally asked, addressing the boys. "I'm Lucas," replied the most confident of them. "These are my brothers Jake, Julian, and Matthew." "Those are nice names," commented Richard with a trembling smile. "And how old are you?" 9 years, 3 months, and 19 days, promptly answered Matthew. "We were born on April 7th. Richard made a quick mental calculation. If the boys were 9 years old, that meant Natalie had discovered the pregnancy right after his disappearance. He had missed everything: the pregnancy, the birth, the first steps, the first words. "I'd like to know exactly what happened," he said, turning to Natalie. From the beginning, Natalie took a deep breath and began to tell. "We had been together for almost 2 years when your father called me for a meeting. He said he knew about our relationship and didn't approve. He said you had potential for great things, but I would be an impediment. He offered money for me to voluntarily step away." "And you refused," concluded Richard. "Of course I refused. I loved you, Richard. I never cared about your money or social position." Natalie paused, composing herself. "The next day I was fired. I tried to contact you, but your phone was turned off. I went to your apartment, but the doorman said you had moved. At the company, no one would give me information. Eventually, your secretary told me you had gone to London on business and had asked not to be disturbed." "I never went to London at that time," interrupted Richard, anger growing in his chest. "I found that out months later," continued Natalie. "But at that moment I believed it. I thought you had grown tired of me and chosen a cowardly way to end things. 2 weeks later, I discovered I was pregnant." Lisa intervened. "She tried everything to find you, Richard, but it was as if you had disappeared from the face of the earth." "Because I was at the family ranch in Montana," explained Richard. "My father told me you had accepted money to stay away, that you had confessed to being with me only out of interest. I was devastated, trusted him without question. He suggested I spend some time at the ranch to cool off. When I returned, a month later, I was determined to forget you and dedicate myself entirely to business. Your father was truly a first-class manipulator, commented Lisa bitterly. Augustus was always obsessed with the company's success and the family legacy, said Elizabeth hesitantly. He thought your relationship with Natalie was a distraction for Richard and a threat to the plans he had laid out. Plans that included my marriage to Fiona, complimented Richard. Yes, the union with the Whitmores was always Augustus's dream. When he learned you were involved with an intern without connections or fortune, he panicked. He couldn't allow anything to threaten the alliance he had planned for years. But the boy— How did you find out about them, Mum? Asked Richard. Elizabeth lowered her eyes. Your father kept Natalie under surveillance for years. He wanted to make sure she wouldn't try to find you again. When the boys were born, he became concerned about the possibility of a scandal and intensified the surveillance. The investigator sent monthly reports, including photos. One day, I found these reports in Augustus's office. And you didn't tell me anything, accused Richard. I confronted your father. I demanded that he tell you the truth, that he allow you to meet your children, but he threatened me. He said if I told, he would take everything from me, my position, my comfort, even access to you, and he said he would make sure you never believed me. Tears streamed down Elizabeth's face. I was a coward, son. I should have fought harder. The boys watched the conversation with serious expressions, absorbing every word exchanged. Lucas, always the boldest, approached Richard. So you didn't know we were your children? No, Lucas, I didn't know. If I had known, I would have moved. Mountains to be with you. Never ever would I have allowed a single day to pass without knowing you. Mom always said our father was busy working in faraway places, commented Jake. Natalie blushed. I thought it was better than saying he didn't want to meet you. I understand why you did that, said Richard softly. You protected them from the truth until they were ready. So, do you want to be our father now? Asked Matthew with his characteristic frankness. The question, so direct and laden with expectation, made Richard's heart tighten. More than anything in the world, he answered honestly. If you and your mother give me that chance— It's not that simple, Richard, intervened Natalie. The boys are 9 years old. You're a stranger to them. You can't just appear in their lives and expect everything to be magically resolved. I know, he agreed. I know we need to go slow. Build trust. But I'm willing to do whatever it takes. I want to make up for every minute lost. How do we know you won't abandon us again? Asked Julian, expressing the fear they all felt. Because now I know the truth, replied Richard, kneeling in front of the boy. Because now I know I have 4 wonderful reasons to be the best version of myself. And because I promise, looking into each of your eyes, that never, ever will I allow anything or anyone to separate us again. The moment was interrupted by the sound of the living room door opening. Everyone turned to see who was entering. Fiona Whitmore, still wearing her wedding dress, but now with disheveled hair and makeup smeared by tears, stormed into the room like a hurricane. Behind her, her father and 2 security guards were trying to catch up. I knew I would find you here, she exclaimed, her feverish gaze moving from Richard to Natalie and the children. You barely waited for the wedding to be cancelled before bringing your other family to our home. Fiona, please, Richard stood up, trying to calm her. This is neither the time nor the place. And when would be the time, Richard? After we were married, or were you planning to keep your bastard children as a dirty little secret forever? Don't speak about my children like that, warned Richard, his voice acquiring a coldness that made the boys instinctively move closer to Natalie. Miss Whitmore, intervened Elizabeth, I understand your disappointment and anger, but I ask that you respect these children. They are innocent in this entire situation. Innocent? They just ruined what should have been the happiest day of my life, shouted Fiona. All of New York is already talking about the scandal. My reputation is ruined. Fiona, calm down, asked her father, finally reaching her. Let's go home. There's nothing to be resolved here today. Not without first making some things clear, she insisted, turning again to Richard. Our agreement is cancelled. The merger contract between our companies will be annulled, and you can be sure your empire will suffer the consequences. Do what you think is best, Fiona. replied Richard calmly. "As for the contract, I can live without it. As for the threats, I suggest you think carefully before starting a war you cannot win." Fiona seemed momentarily disconcerted by Richard's tranquility. She had expected pleas, apologies, perhaps even a proposal to postpone the wedding while they resolved the situation. She wasn't prepared for a man who seemed to have completely reordered his priorities in a matter of hours. "You'll regret this, Richard," she finally said, allowing her father to lead her out. "Nobody humiliates me like this and gets away with it." When the door closed behind her, there was an awkward moment of silence. "Sorry about that," said Richard, turning to Natalie and the boys. "Fiona has always been intense." "She seemed like an evil witch from a movie," commented Julian, provoking nervous laughter from everyone. "And we shouldn't speak about other people like that," Natalie gently reprimanded, but with a small smile. The tension had been broken, and the conversation flowed more easily from there. The boys, gradually more comfortable, began to ask Richard questions about his life, his likes, his work. He answered everything with patience and honesty, amazed by the intelligence and unique personality of each of his sons. When the clock struck 11, Natalie realized it was time to go. The boys, despite their excitement, were beginning to show signs of fatigue. "We need to go," she announced. "It's been a long and emotionally draining day for everyone." "Couldn't you stay?" Richard suggested hesitantly. "The house has many rooms and it's already late." "I don't think that would be appropriate, Richard," Natalie replied firmly. "We need to process everything that's happened. The boys need time." Richard nodded, understanding. "Can I see them tomorrow?" Natalie exchanged glances with Lisa and then with the boys, who seemed anxious for the answer. "Maybe we could have lunch together, at a restaurant, a neutral place." "Perfect," Richard immediately agreed. "Can I pick you up?" "We prefer to meet you there," replied Natalie. "I'll send the address in the morning." While Natalie gathered the boys' things, Richard approached his mother, who had remained silent for most of the evening. "We need to talk, Mom," he said quietly, "about everything that happened, about the role you played." "I know, son," Elizabeth replied sadly, "and I'm ready to face the consequences of my choices. I only ask that you allow me to be part of my grandchildren's lives, even if you can't forgive me." "I don't know if I can forgive yet," admitted Richard, "but I know my children need a grandmother. We'll see how things develop." When Natalie and the boys were ready to depart, Richard accompanied them to the door. Each of the boys said goodbye, to him with a formal and slightly awkward handshake, except for Lucas, who impulsively hugged him. Richard felt his eyes well up at the unexpected gesture. "See you tomorrow, Dad," said the boy, testing the word. "See you tomorrow, son," replied Richard, his voice choked. Watching Natalie's car drive away through the gates of the mansion, Richard felt a mixture of emotions he had never experienced before. There was pain for the lost time, anger at his father's manipulation, fear of not being able to be the father his children deserved, but above all, there was hope. For the first time in 10 years, he felt his life had a true purpose. The next morning, Richard woke up early after a restless night. His mind was still processing the events of the previous day, the cancelled wedding, the revelation about his children, the truth about Natalie's disappearance. While having his coffee, Henry arrived, bringing newspapers and magazines. "It's on all the covers," he announced, spreading the publications on the table. "The wedding of the century that ended in scandal. Morrison heir discovers quadruplets on wedding day. Bride abandoned at the altar because of secret children." The sensationalist headlines screamed from the colourful pages. "It was to be expected," commented Richard, surprisingly calm. "Fiona is probably furious." "Furious is an understatement," confirmed Henry. "Robert Whitmore has already announced he's terminating all contracts with the Morrison Group. The stocks fell 5% as soon as the market opened." "Let them fall," replied Richard, to his friend's astonishment. "I have enough reserves to weather a temporary storm." "You don't seem worried," observed Henry. "I'm concerned with more important things now," explained Richard. "Like earning my children's trust, like winning back Natalie if she gives me that chance." Henry smiled, seeing his friend in a new light. "I never thought I'd live to see Richard Morrison, the business shark, talking like this." Priorities change when you discover you have 4 9-year-old sons, replied Richard with a tired smile. I need your help, Henry. I want to prepare everything to welcome them here. I need to transform this cold house into a place where children want to be. Count on me, assured Henry. And if you need anything with the press or with the Whitmores, I'm at your disposal. Meanwhile, in the Brooklyn apartment, Natalie was also facing the consequences of the previous night. Her phone wouldn't stop ringing. Journalists, curious, acquaintances, even former co-workers wanting to know the details of the Morrison scandal. She had turned off the device and instructed Lisa to do the same. The boys, on the other hand, were excited about the prospect of having lunch with their newly discovered father. They were getting ready with unusual care, discussing what they should wear and what questions they would ask. Do you think he'll like us? Asked Jake, the most insecure of the 4. Of course he will, replied Lucas confidently. He already does. Did you see how happy he was when he saw us? He seemed more scared than happy, pondered Matthew, always observant. That's normal, right? Intervened Julian. He suddenly discovered he has 4 sons. Anyone would be scared. Natalie, hearing her son's conversation while preparing breakfast, felt her heart tighten. They were so eager to meet their father, so willing to accept him into their lives, that she feared they would be disappointed if Richard didn't meet their expectations. Boys, she called, gathering them at the kitchen table, I want you to understand something. Your father didn't know about you until yesterday. He's going to need time to get used to the idea of being a father, and you're also going to need time to really get to know him. Don't expect everything to be resolved in one day. But he said he wants to be our father, argued Lucas, that he'll be present from now on. And I believe he's sincere, replied Natalie. But life is complicated, Lucas. Richard has a huge company to run, probably has many commitments. I don't know how much time he can really dedicate to you. He's rich, isn't he? Asked Julian. Can he give us cool presents? Julian, reprimanded Natalie. It's not about presents or money, it's about presence, about love, and that's something no money in the world can buy. Sorry, Mom, mumbled the boy, embarrassed. It's okay, sighed Natalie. I just want you to be realistic. We're going to get to know your father better, give it time and see how things develop. Deal? The 4 boys solemnly nodded, although it was evident the excitement hadn't diminished. At 11:30, as agreed, Natalie and the boys arrived at the chosen restaurant, a family establishment in Greenwich Village, known for its traditional American food. Richard was already waiting for them, visibly nervous, but smiling. You came, he said as if he couldn't believe it. We promised, didn't we? Replied Natalie, trying to keep the tone light. The lunch began somewhat awkwardly, with tentative conversations and long moments of silence, but as the meal progressed, the tension decreased. The boys, naturally curious and spontaneous, bombarded Richard with questions about his life, his likes, his experiences. He answered everything with patience and sincerity, delighted with the unique personality of each one. Do you like football? Asked Lucas, who played as a defender on the school team. I do. I've been a Giants fan since I was a kid, replied Richard. Us too, exclaimed all 4 in unison, provoking laughter. Your mother raised you well, commented Richard, giving Natalie a grateful look, which she returned with a discreet smile. She took us to the stadium twice, recounted Jake. But it's hard to get tickets. Well, maybe I can help with that, suggested Richard. I have a permanent box at MetLife Stadium. Would you like to go to a game with me? The boys' eyes lit up at the possibility, and they all looked at Natalie, awaiting her approval. If you're... They're not too busy, she replied, cautious. I'll never be too busy for my children, assured Richard. In fact, I've been thinking about completely reorganizing my schedule, delegating more responsibilities, reducing my personal commitments. I want to have time to be present in their lives. Natalie studied him, looking for signs that this was just talk to impress her, but all she saw was sincerity. That would be good for them, she finally admitted. When lunch ended, none of them wanted the meeting to end. Richard suggested a walk through Central Park, and the boys excitedly accepted. During the afternoon, Richard discovered that Lucas loved astronomy and dreamed of being an astronaut, that Jake had a talent for mathematics and enjoyed solving puzzles, that Julian was passionate about animals and wanted to be a veterinarian, and that Matthew, the quietist, adored reading and writing stories. Natalie observed the interaction with a mixture of joy and apprehension. It was wonderful to see her children so happy, so excited about meeting their father. But part of her still feared that all of this was temporary, that Richard would eventually tire of fatherhood, or that his professional obligations would pull him away again. When the sun began to set, Natalie announced it was time to return. Home. The boys protested but eventually agreed. "Can I see you again tomorrow?" asked Richard, reluctant to say goodbye. "Tomorrow is a school day," reminded Natalie. "And then there's homework, extracurricular activities." "I could pick them up from school," he suggested. "Help with homework. Take them to their activities." Natalie hesitated. "Richard, I understand your enthusiasm, but we need to go slow. The boys have an established routine. We can't just change everything at once." "Of course, you're right," he agreed, although the disappointment was visible on his face. "How about the weekend, then? Saturday we could do something together all day." Natalie looked at the boys, who awaited her answer with evident expectation. "All right. Saturday can work." The following days were a whirlwind for Richard. On Monday, he convened an emergency meeting with all the directors of the Morrison Group. He announced drastic changes in the organizational structure of the company, delegating many of his responsibilities to trusted executives and significantly reducing his personal workload. "But sir," protested the financial director, "with the crisis caused by the break with the Whitmores, we need your direct leadership more than ever." "And you'll have it," assured Richard, "but not at the cost of my family. I lost 10 years of my children's lives. I'm not going to lose another day." The news that Richard Morrison, the notorious workaholic, was reducing his work hours to dedicate time to his newly discovered family caused almost as much buzz in business circles as the scandal of the cancelled wedding. Some analysts predicted the fall of the Morrison Group without the full dedication of its CEO. Others applauded the decision, seeing it as a sign of emotional maturity. Meanwhile, Fiona and her father were fulfilling their promise of retaliation. Besides cancelling all existing contracts with the Morrison Group, they initiated a behind-the-scenes campaign to dissuade other business partners from doing the same. The company's stocks continued to fall, and shareholders were beginning to get restless. On Wednesday, Richard received an unexpected call from Mrs. Teresa, Fiona's mother, asking to meet him privately. They met at a discreet cafe in the city centre. "I came without my husband's or daughter's knowledge," explained the elegant lady as soon as they sat down. "But I felt I needed to give you a warning." "What kind of warning?" asked Richard, cautious. "Robert is beside himself. He sees the union of the Morrison and Whitmore families as the pinnacle of his career, his great legacy. Now that this has fallen apart, he is determined to destroy you. Mrs. Teresa, with all due respect, I know your husband is powerful, but I don't fear his threats. My company is solid enough to survive this crisis." "It's not just about business, Richard," she continued, lowering her voice. "He hired investigators to search through your life, Natalie's life, even your children's lives. He's looking for anything he can use against you." Richard felt a wave of anger and concern. "If he dares to get close to my children—" "That's why I came to warn you," interrupted Mrs. Teresa. "I'm a mother. I know what it means to protect children, and although Fiona is hurt, she wouldn't approve of her father's methods. Be careful, Richard, and protect your family." Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out, now continuing. That conversation left Richard deeply disturbed. Immediately after leaving the cafe, he called Natalie, asking to meet urgently. They met at her apartment after the boys went to bed. "Robert Whitmore has hired investigators to watch us," explained Richard without preamble, as soon as Natalie opened the door. "They're looking for any information that could harm us, including the boys." Natalie paled. "My God, how far will this man go? What does he expect to find? Anything that could publicly discredit me or create legal problems. We need to be cautious, Natalie. Increase the boys' security, verify who approaches them. They're just children, Richard, exclaimed Natalie, her voice trembling with indignation. How can anyone use them in a game of corporate revenge? People, like Robert Whitmore, have no limits, replied Richard somberly. I want you and the boys to temporarily move to a safer place. I have a beach house in the Hamptons with private security. You would be protected there. Move? But what about the boys' school? My work at the studio? We can't just abandon our lives because a powerful man is angry. I understand your resistance, but I'm concerned about your safety. If you don't want to go to the beach, at least consider moving to my house in the city. The mansion has 24-hour security, and it would be easier for me to protect all of you if you were close. Natalie shook her head, visibly disturbed. It's too early for that, Richard. We can't just move into your house after a week of reunion. The boys need stability. Routine. And you and I, we need to define what kind of relationship we'll have going forward. Richard sighed, recognizing the wisdom in her words. You're right, I'm panicking and not thinking clearly, but at least allow me to reinforce the security of this building. I can hire discreet guards to monitor the entrances and exits, ensure that you're protected without interfering with your routine. After some discussion, Natalie agreed to the additional security, although she still felt uncomfortable with the idea. There's another thing we need to discuss, said Richard, after the security issue was resolved. I want to legally formalize my paternity, give my last name to the boys, ensure they have all rights as my heirs. Natalie studied him for a moment. Is this really about the boys or about your inheritance and your empire? It's about both, admitted Richard honestly. I want my children to have everything they're entitled to. My name, my financial support, my legal protection. But I also want to ensure that no one can question their legitimacy as my heirs. And if I say we don't want your money, that I've raised my children alone until now and can continue doing so. I would respect your independence, replied Richard, but I would still ask that you allow me to contribute to their future, not out of pride, but because it's my duty as a father. I lost 10 years, Natalie. I couldn't help when you needed it. At least let me ensure they have every possible opportunity from now on. Richard's sincerity was evident, and Natalie felt her resistance diminish. I need to think about this. Talk to the boys too. They're young, but they have opinions about their own lives. Of course. Take the time you need. I just ask that you keep an open mind. When Richard left the apartment that night, Natalie remained awake for hours, reflecting on how drastically her life had changed in just 1 week. Part of her still feared it was all temporary, that Richard's interest in the boys would diminish over time, or that he would eventually return to prioritizing his company over family. But another part, the one that had never completely stopped loving Richard, wanted to believe he had changed, that he truly wanted to be the father her children deserved. On Friday, Elizabeth Morrison asked to see her grandchildren. Natalie, although hesitant, agreed to a brief meeting. The elderly woman arrived at the apartment carrying 4 identical packages, each containing an antique watch. They were my grandfather's, she explained, as the boys unwrapped the gifts with curiosity. He left them for his first great-grandson. Since I have 4, I had exact replicas made so each one could have his own. The boys, enchanted with the elegant pocket watches, thanked her politely. Elizabeth observed them with tears in her eyes, noting how each one, despite their identical appearance, had unique mannerisms and expressions. Natalie, she said when the boys went to show the watches to Lisa, I know I have no right to ask for anything. I was an accomplice, even if passive, to Augustus's manipulations, but I beg you to give me the chance to know my grandchildren, to be part of their lives. Mrs. Elizabeth, replied Natalie carefully, I don't hold a grudge against you. I believe you were as much a victim of your husband's manipulations as Richard and I were. But I need to protect my children. They're already dealing with many changes, discovering a father they never knew. We need to go slow. I completely understand, nodded Elizabeth. I'll go at your pace, at their pace. I just ask that you don't exclude me completely. I won't do that, assured Natalie. The boys deserve to know their grandmother. We can start with short visits like this, see how things evolve. Elizabeth smiled, grateful for the opportunity. Thank you, Natalie, and know that, despite everything Augustus did, Richard always loved you, even in the years when he believed He had been betrayed. He never managed to completely forget you. Those words stayed with Natalie long after Elizabeth left. They resurrected feelings she had tried to bury for a decade. The deep love she had felt for Richard, the pain of forced separation, the secret hope that one day they might meet again. On Saturday, as agreed, Richard took the boys and Natalie for a day in Central Park. He had planned everything meticulously. A picnic prepared by his mansion's chef, bicycles for everyone, even a portable telescope for Lucas, who loved astronomy. "I know we can't see the stars during the day," explained Richard when the boy unwrapped the gift, "but I thought we could use it to observe birds and the landscape today, and then someday plan a night of stargazing." Lucas hugged his father impulsively, a gesture that made Richard's eyes well up. It was the first spontaneous hug he had received from his son, and its significance wasn't lost on him. During the picnic, Richard noticed that Natalie seemed more relaxed than in previous meetings. She smiled more easily, participated in the boys' games, and even allowed their hands to touch briefly when they both reached for the same fruit basket. A contact that sent an electrical current through Richard's arm. "You seem different today," he commented when the boys moved away to explore the nearby park, still within the adults' field of vision. "Different how?" asked Natalie, blushing slightly. "Lighter, less defensive, as if you're finally allowing this moment to happen instead of just tolerating it." Natalie smiled, surprising him. "Maybe I am. Your mother told me something yesterday that made me think." "My mother? What did she say?" "That you never completely forgot me, even when you believed I had betrayed you." Richard nodded slowly. "She's right. I tried, God knows how I tried. But there was something about you, Natalie. Something that refused to disappear from my mind, from my heart. For me it was even worse," she confessed, "because every day I saw your eyes in our children's faces. It was a constant reminder of what we had lost." Richard cautiously took her hand, half expecting her to pull away. But Natalie allowed the contact, their fingers intertwining naturally, as if the 10 years of separation had never happened. "Do you believe we can recover what we lost?" he asked softly. "No," she replied, making his heart sink momentarily. "We can't recover the lost time, Richard, but maybe we can build something new, something different, but equally valuable." Hope lit up in Richard's chest again. "That's all I ask. A chance to build our children's future together, and perhaps with time our own future as well." Natalie didn't answer with words, but the look they exchanged contained a silent promise. The promise to try, to give a chance to what had once been the great love of their lives. The moment was interrupted by the excited shouts of the boys, returning from their exploration. The rest of the day passed in an atmosphere of joy and discoveries, with Richard revealing himself to be an attentive and playful father, eager to make up for lost time. In the following week, the Morrison Group faced its first major challenge after the break with the Whitmores. One of the construction company's largest projects, a commercial complex in downtown Manhattan, was about to lose its main investor, a close friend of Robert Whitmore. "He's cancelling the contract without legal justification," explained Henry during an emergency meeting. "It's clearly a retaliation orchestrated by Robert. We can sue him for breach of contract, but it would be a long and costly battle. And meanwhile, the project is stalled. Hundreds of workers are laid off and our reputation takes another blow," completed Edward, the financial director. Richard listened to his team's concerns attentively, but his expression remained calm. "Maybe there's another solution. What if we finance the rest of the project ourselves? That would seriously compromise our working capital," warned Edward, "especially now with the stocks falling." "But it would give us complete control over the project," argued Richard. "We could redesign it, make it even more ambitious, transform this challenge into an opportunity to show that the Morrison Group not only survives without the Whitmores, but thrives." The boldness of the proposal surprised the board. The Richard they knew, methodical and averse to unnecessary risks, seemed to have given way to a more visionary and confident leader. "There's more," added Richard. "I want to transform part of the complex into a technological education center for low-income youth, a social project that bears the Morrison name, not as a symbol of power or wealth, but of social responsibility and commitment to the future. An educational center? Repeated Henry, surprised. That wasn't in the original plans. Many things have changed in the last few weeks, replied Richard with a smile. My perspective on the legacy I want to leave is one of them. I have 4 sons now. I want them to grow up proud of the name they carry, not just for the financial success it represents, but for the positive impact it creates. The board, after some discussion, ended up supporting the plan. The announcement that the Morrison Group would not only maintain the commercial complex project, but also expand it to include an educational center, was received with enthusiasm by the media and the market. The company's shares, which had been steadily falling since the wedding scandal, began to recover. Robert Whitmore, upon learning of the initiative, was furious. His strategy to destabilize Richard was failing. Determined not to be defeated, he intensified his efforts to find compromising information about the Morrison family. It was in this context that one of the investigators hired by Robert discovered something potentially explosive. He appeared in Robert's office with a folder full of documents. "What did you find?" Robert asked eagerly. "Something about Richard's mother, sir. Elizabeth Morrison is not who everyone thinks." Robert smiled maliciously as he leafed through the documents. "This is interesting. Very interesting indeed. Perhaps we can't attack Richard directly, but his mother and, by extension, the legitimacy of the entire Morrison empire. That's another story." While Robert planned his next move, Richard and Natalie continued rebuilding their relationship. After several weeks of family gatherings and honest conversations, Natalie finally accepted to have dinner alone with Richard, their first romantic date in a decade. He took her to a small Italian restaurant in the West Village, away from the spotlight and the cameras that still occasionally pursued them. The place was cozy and discreet, with tables separated by trellises covered with ivy and soft candlelight. "Remember the first time we had dinner together?" asked Richard as they savored the wine. "How could I forget?" smiled Natalie. "You showed up at my student dorm with a picnic basket because I had said I couldn't go out to dinner since I needed to study for an exam. The most improvised dinner in history," laughed Richard. "Sandwiches and cheap wine sitting on the rug in your tiny room." "It was perfect," recalled Natalie with nostalgia. "So different from the elaborate and expensive experiences you were used to. I think it was that night I really fell in love with you, seeing the Morrison heir sitting on the floor, eating sandwiches and laughing like a child. And I fell in love with you the moment I saw you fiercely arguing with my father about the structural problems in the Hudson Project. You, a 22-year-old intern, confronting the fearsome Augustus Morrison without blinking." "Your father detested me from the first day," remembered Natalie. "I think he realized before we did that something special was happening." "He realized you were different," agreed Richard. "That you weren't impressed by money or power. That you saw beyond the facade of the Morrison Empire. And that terrified him, because it meant I might choose a different path than the one he had traced." "And is that what you're doing now? Choosing a different path?" Richard nodded, holding her, hand across the table. "I'm trying. It's not easy. I spent years following in my father's footsteps, believing that success meant power, control, expansion at any cost. But now I want to build something that makes my children proud. Something that reflects the values I want them to have." "That's quite a transformation," commented Natalie. "I have to admit that part of me still fears it's temporary, that eventually the old Richard, obsessed with work and power, will resurface." "It's a fair fear," he admitted. "I can't promise I'll never make mistakes again, or that I've completely transformed overnight, but I can promise that I'm committed to this change, to our family, and I hope that with time, my actions will prove this more than any words could." At the end of the night, Richard drove Natalie back to her apartment. At the door there was a moment of hesitation, a silence laden with expectation. "Thank you for dinner," said Natalie softly. "It was a wonderful night." "Can we do it again?" asked Richard, his voice betraying the anxiety he felt. "I would like that," she replied with a smile. Slowly, Richard leaned in, giving Natalie time to back away if she wanted. But she didn't back away. Their lips met in a gentle, tentative kiss, as if they were rediscovering each other after a long journey apart. When they separated, both had tears in their eyes, tears for the lost time and for renewed hope. "Good night, Natalie," whispered Richard. "Good night, Richard," she replied, entering the apartment with a lighter heart than she had felt in years. The next morning, the front page of all major newspapers and news portals exploded with a bombshell headline: "Morrison Empire Built on Lies, Elizabeth Morrison Hides Dark Secret." Richard was having coffee when Henry arrived at the mansion, carrying the newspapers and a grave expression. "It's bad, Richard. Very bad." The article, clearly planted by Robert Whitmore, alleged that Elizabeth Morrison wasn't who she claimed to be. According to discovered documents, Elizabeth had been born as Eleanor Sanders, daughter of a humble family from rural Virginia. She had changed her identity after a scandal in her hometown and married Augustus Morrison under false pretenses, hiding her origins from him. "This could legally compromise the legitimacy of your parents' marriage," explained Henry worriedly, "and by extension, call into question the right of succession to the Morrison empire." "That's ridiculous," countered Richard. "Even if my mother changed her name before meeting my father, it doesn't affect my legal rights." "Not legally, perhaps, but in public perception, in investor confidence. Robert is playing dirty, Richard. He wants to destabilize the company through scandal, making shareholders doubt the solidity of Morrison leadership." Richard immediately picked up the phone, calling his mother. Elizabeth answered after several rings, her voice weak and trembling. "Mum, where are you? I need to talk to you urgently." "At home, son. I've already seen the news. Don't leave. I'm coming to you." Upon arriving at his mother's apartment, Richard found her sitting in the living room, pale and downcast, but with a silent dignity that had always characterized her. "Is it true?" he asked directly, sitting across from her. Elizabeth took a deep breath and nodded. "Yes, part of it at least. I was born as Eleanor Sanders, in rural Virginia. I changed my name before meeting your father, but not for the reasons they insinuate in the newspapers." "Why then?" Elizabeth closed her eyes for a moment, as if gathering strength to relive painful memories. "I was 17 when my father died in an accident at the factory where he worked. The company refused to pay any compensation, claiming it was his negligence. My mother tried to sue, but she was a woman alone against a powerful corporation. We ended up losing everything." Richard listened in silence, realizing he was about to hear a story his mother had kept for decades. "My mother fell ill soon after, destroyed by the loss and the hardships. I was the only one who could work, but no one in town wanted to hire me. Everyone feared retaliation from the factory. So I did what many desperate young women do. I came to New York, changed my name to Elizabeth Miller, and started a new life." "And you met my father," completed Richard. "Yes, a few years later. I was working as a secretary in a company that did business with the Morrison Group. Your father noticed me, we started dating, and eventually got married. I never told him about my past because for me, Eleanor Sanders had been left behind. Elizabeth was who I was now." "He never found out?" "He did, yes. Years later, when you were about 5. An old employee recognized me from Virginia, and the truth came out. Augustus was furious. Not for the name change itself, but because he felt I had deceived him. He threatened to leave me, to take you away from me." "But he didn't," observed Richard. "No. Instead, he used it to control me. Whenever I challenged him or disagreed with his decisions, he reminded me that he could expose my secret and destroy my reputation. Over time, I became exactly what he wanted, a docile and obedient wife who never questioned his actions, no matter how cruel they were." The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together for Richard, like when he separated Natalie and me. "Exactly. When I found out about the boys, I confronted your father. I demanded that he tell the truth, that he allow you to meet your children. It was the only time I truly challenged him, and he responded with his usual threat. He would destroy my reputation, ensure you would never believe me, leave me with nothing." "And you backed down," concluded Richard without accusation in his voice. "Yes," admitted Elizabeth, tears streaming down her wrinkled face. "I was weak, son. I should have fought harder, risked everything for your happiness. But the fear paralyzed me. And now Robert Whitmore has done exactly what your father threatened to do for all these years." Richard stood up and sat beside his mother, taking her trembling hands in his. "Mom, listen to me. We have nothing to fear. It doesn't matter what name you used before or why you changed it. What matters is that you're my mother, that you loved and cared for me, and we'll face this together as a family." "What are you going to do?" asked Elizabeth, her voice weak. "First, I'm going to call Natalie and explain everything, before she reads it in the newspapers. Then, we're going to hold a press conference. We're going to tell your story, Mom, not as a sordid scandal, but as what it really is, the story of a brave young woman who faced unimaginable adversities and managed to rebuild her life. And we're going to make it clear to Robert Whitmore that he chose the wrong adversary." As Richard called Natalie, Elizabeth watched him with a mixture of pride and relief. For the first time in decades, she felt truly free from the secret she had carried, free from the fear that had controlled her for so long. Natalie, upon hearing the story, showed no shock or disappointment, only understanding. "We need to protect Mrs. Elizabeth and the boys. The press will go crazy with this." "I have a plan," assured Richard, "but I'll need your help." "Are you with me on this?" "I'm with you," replied Natalie without hesitation, "in everything." 2 hours later, the Morrison Group issued an official statement calling a press conference for that afternoon. Speculation ran wild in the media. Some bet that Richard would announce his resignation amid the scandal. Others predicted legal retaliation against the Whitmores. When Richard took the stage at the Morrison Group headquarters auditorium, he was accompanied not only by his mother, but also by Natalie and his 4 sons. The image of the united family facing adversity together was instantly captured by dozens of cameras. "Good afternoon, everyone," began Richard, his voice firm and confident. "I called this press conference to clarify some facts about my family. Yes, my mother was born as Eleanor Sanders and changed her name to Elizabeth before meeting my father. But contrary to what certain reports suggest, there's nothing shameful or illegal about that change." Richard then told his mother's story. The loss of her father, the financial hardships, the brave decision to start over in New York. He spoke about how Augustus Morrison had used this secret to control Elizabeth for decades, and how that same control had allowed him to separate Richard from Natalie and their children. "The real scandal isn't that my mother changed her name 50 years ago. The real scandal is that my father used this fact to manipulate and control his own family. The real scandal is that Robert Whitmore, unable to accept that his daughter was rejected at the altar, resorts to dirty tactics to try to destabilize my company and my family." Looking directly at the cameras, Richard continued, "To Mr. Whitmore, I leave a message. Your attempts to harm us are only making us stronger. My family, my mother, Natalie, and our 4 wonderful children is united as never before. And the Morrison Group will continue to prosper, not through manipulation or power games, but through honest work, innovation, and social responsibility." It was then that Richard made the announcement no one expected. "Additionally, I'm proud to announce today the creation of the Eleanor Sanders Morrison Foundation, which will be dedicated to supporting women and children in vulnerable situations. The foundation, which will bear my mother's birth name, will initially be funded with $100 million from my personal assets. Because we believe that a true legacy isn't built with secrets and manipulations, but with truth and generosity." The reaction from the public and the press was immediate and overwhelming. What Robert Whitmore had planned as a devastating blow to the Morrisons' reputation had transformed into an inspiring story of overcoming and redemption. In the following days, the story of Eleanor Elizabeth Morrison dominated the news, but not as a scandal, rather as an example of resilience and courage. The Morrison Group's shares, which had initially fallen with the revelation, quickly recovered and surpassed their previous value. The Eleanor Sanders Morrison Foundation received support and donations from business people and celebrities across the country, and Robert Whitmore, seeing his strategy blow up in his face, retreated into a furious silence. Meanwhile, the relationship between Richard and Natalie continued to flourish. After the press conference, when they finally were alone, Richard held Natalie's hands and looked into her eyes. "You were amazing today," he said, "standing by my side, supporting my mother, protecting our children. I have no words to thank you." "You don't need to thank me," replied Natalie softly. "It's what families do, support each other in difficult times." "Family," repeated Richard, savoring the word. "That's what we are now, isn't it? A real family." "We're becoming one," agreed Natalie. "Day by day." "Natalie," began Richard, his heart racing, "I know it's still early, that we're just beginning to rebuild what we lost. But I want you to know that for me, you were always the only one. Even in the years when I believed I had been betrayed, I never managed to love anyone else the way I loved you, the way I still love you." Natalie felt tears spring to her eyes. "I never stopped loving you either, Richard, but I was so afraid to allow myself to feel that again, to believe we could have a second chance." "We have that chance now," affirmed Richard, caressing her face. "And I promise not to waste it. I want to spend every day proving that I deserve your love, that I deserve to be the father of our children." "You're already proving it," smiled Natalie through her tears. "Every day, with every gesture." They kissed then, not the tentative kiss of their first date, but a deep and passionate kiss laden with promises for the future. In the following weeks, Natalie and the boys began to spend more time at the Morrison mansion. At first only on weekends, then they would occasionally stay for dinner during the week. And eventually, when the boys were on school break, they began to stay for longer periods, until the mansion began to feel like their home too. A month after the press conference, Elizabeth suggested a complete remodeling of the mansion. "This place has always been cold and impersonal," she explained to Richard and Natalie. "It was designed to impress, not to welcome. If we're going to be a real family, we need a real home." With the enthusiastic support of the boys, Natalie, who had completed her architecture degree years before, took on the project of transforming the mansion. Walls were knocked down to create more open and integrated spaces. Warm colors replaced the cold and neutral tones, and comfortable furniture took the place of elegant but uncomfortable designer pieces. Richard's formal office on the first floor was transformed into a games and study room for the boys. His father would have been horrified by the change, but Richard enthusiastically approved it. He now worked primarily in a smaller, cozier office on the ground floor, where the boys could freely enter to talk or just to be near him while he did his administrative tasks. As the mansion transformed, so did the family dynamics. The boys, initially cautious with Richard, now constantly sought his company. Lucas challenged him to chess matches, Jake asked for help with math problems, Julian dragged him on long walks observing birds in the garden, and Matthew shared the stories he wrote, eager for his opinion. Elizabeth, for her part, flourished in her role as grandmother. Free from the weight of the secret she had carried for so long, she revealed herself to be affectionate and playful, always willing to tell stories about Richard's childhood or teach the boys old family recipes. One night, while the boys slept, after a day full of activities, Richard found Natalie on the porch, contemplating the garden illuminated by the moon. "I've been thinking," he said, joining her. "Maybe it's time to make things official." "What things?" asked Natalie, although she suspected where he was heading. "Everything. My legal paternity of the boys, our relationship, the fact that you're practically living here but still maintain the apartment in Brooklyn." "Are you asking us to move in permanently?" clarified Natalie. "I'm asking for much more than that," replied Richard, taking a small velvet box from his pocket. Kneeling before her, he opened the box to reveal a stunning but elegantly simple diamond ring. "I'm asking you to be my wife, Natalie, to allow me to spend the rest of my life making up for the years we lost, to officially form the family our children deserve." Natalie looked at the ring, at Richard kneeling, and felt all the defenses she had built over the years completely crumble. "Yes," she answered simply, tears of joy streaming down her face. "Yes, I want to be your wife." Richard slid the ring onto her finger and pulled her into a tight embrace, his own face wet with tears. "I promise I will never again allow anything to separate us. I promise to be the husband and father you deserve. I promise to dedicate every day to making you happy." "And I promise never again to let lies or manipulations come between us," replied Natalie. "I promise to trust in our love, even in difficult moments. I promise to build with you the family we always dreamed of." When they told the boys about the engagement the next morning, the reaction was pure joy. Lucas, always the unofficial spokesperson for the brothers, expressed the feeling of all, "Finally, we're going to be a real family." "You always were a real family," Richard gently corrected. "Now I'm the lucky one who gets to join you." Natalie watched with her heart overflowing with love as her 4 sons jumped on Richard, knocking him onto the sofa amid laughter and awkward hugs. The journey to get here had been long and full of obstacles, but looking at her family gathered together, her true family, she knew that every challenge had been worth it. The wedding was held 6 months later, an intimate ceremony in the gardens of the Morrison mansion, now truly transformed into a home. Only close family members and dear friends were invited, nothing like the social spectacle that would have been the wedding with Fiona. The 4 boys, wearing identical suits, were the honored attendants, proudly standing beside their father throughout the ceremony. Elizabeth, radiant in an elegant blue dress, led Natalie down the improvised aisle between the garden flowers, and when Richard saw his bride approaching, he knew he was living the happiest moment of his life. The vows were simple and sincere, speaking of forgiveness, new beginnings, and promises for the future. When the officiant declared them husband and wife, it wasn't just the union of 2 people, but the official consecration of a family that had overcome lies, manipulations, and years of separation to finally be together. At the party that followed, as he watched his sons dancing animatedly and his now wife chatting with Elizabeth, Richard reflected on the incredible journey he had traveled. The man who once lived only for business and power, blindly following, in the footsteps of his manipulative father, had found a much greater purpose, not in the business empire that continued to prosper, not in the respect or fear his name inspired in corporate circles, but in the love of his family. The day after the wedding, when the house had returned to normal, Richard gathered everyone in the newly remodeled living room. On the main wall he had installed a huge frame, not an expensive artwork like those that previously decorated the mansion, but an enlarged photograph of his new family, taken during an outdoor excursion, with everyone smiling naturally, truly happy. "I want this photo to remind us every day of what really matters," he explained. "Not money, not power, not appearances, but the love we share." Lucas, observing the photo attentively, commented, "It's funny to think that all this began because you wanted to get revenge on Mom, inviting her to your other wedding." Richard laughed, shaking his head. "Life has a peculiar sense of humor, doesn't it? What was supposed to be my revenge ended up being my salvation." "And ours," added Natalie, intertwining her fingers with his, "because without that invitation, perhaps we would never have found the courage to face the past and reveal the truth." "I think the most important lesson I learned in all this," reflected Richard, "is that true success isn't in the empires we build or the power we accumulate. It's in the genuine connections we form, in the happiness we create for ourselves and for those we love." The 4 boys, now officially Morrison not just in blood but also in name, looked at their father with admiration and love. They were still learning to truly know him, just as he was still learning to be the father they deserved. But each day, each shared moment, the bonds strengthened. Elizabeth, observing her son, her daughter-in-law, and her grandchildren, felt a peace she hadn't experienced in decades. The secrets that had imprisoned her for so long had finally been revealed, and instead of destruction, they brought liberation. She had feared for decades that the truth about her past would cause the family's ruin, but ironically, it was precisely this truth that allowed the family to rebuild itself on more solid and honest foundations. "You know," she said, joining the group, "your father always believed he was building a legacy through power and influence, but you, Richard, are building a much more valuable and lasting legacy, a legacy of love, honesty, and forgiveness." Richard hugged his mother, moved by her words. "And you are a fundamental part of that legacy, Mom. Eleanor or Elizabeth, it doesn't matter. You were always the silent strength that kept this family together, even in the most difficult times." In the months and years that followed, the Morrison family faced its challenges like any family. There were arguments, moments of tension, necessary adjustments to the new family dynamic. The boys entered adolescence, bringing new challenges and concerns. The company went through economic crises and periods of expansion. But through it all, one thing remained constant: Richard and Natalie's commitment to their family and to the truth that had reunited them. The Eleanor Sanders Morrison Foundation grew and became one of the country's largest organizations supporting vulnerable women and children. Natalie, using her architecture training, led a foundation project to build dignified housing for low-income families. Elizabeth, finding her voice after decades of silence, became an inspiring speaker, sharing her story of overcoming with women facing similar adversities. Robert Whitmore eventually acknowledged his defeat. Years later, when his own company was facing difficulties, it was Richard who extended his hand, offering a partnership that would benefit both groups. The gesture of generosity, which would have been unthinkable for the old Richard, demonstrated how much he had truly changed. On a quiet autumn Sunday, almost 5 years after their wedding, Richard and Natalie sat on the porch of the mansion, now truly a home, watching their sons play football in the garden. Lucas, Jake, Julian, and Matthew, now teenagers, remained inseparable, although each had developed unique interests and talents. "You know what I sometimes think?" commented Natalie, resting her head on her husband's shoulder. "That invitation to your wedding was the best thing that could have happened. You wanted to humiliate me, but you ended up giving us a second chance." Richard laughed softly. "The universe has a peculiar sense of humor. I was so trapped in my anger, in my pride. If it weren't for that night, for you having the courage to face everything and show up with the boys, I almost gave up," confessed Natalie. "I spent hours thinking about whether I should go, whether it was worth exposing the boys to that situation. But something inside me said it was the right thing to do, that you deserved to know the truth, that our children deserved to know their father. And now here we are," concluded Richard, squeezing her hand. "A real family built not on appearances or expectations, but on love, forgiveness, and honesty." In that moment, watching his sons laugh and play under the autumn sun, Richard knew, with absolute certainty, that he had found the true meaning of success. Not in the financial empire he continued to competently manage, but in the family he had almost lost, and that was now the center of his existence. The old wedding invitation, the one that Richard had sent to Natalie with intentions of revenge, was framed in his office, not as a reminder of anger or regret, but as a symbol of the transformative power of love and truth. A daily reminder that sometimes life's greatest gifts come disguised as challenges, and that revenge, when transformed by love, can become redemption. The end. Dear listeners, what did you think of this emotional story of love, forgiveness, and second chances? Would Richard have found true happiness if he hadn't invited Natalie to his wedding? Do you believe he would have been happy with Fiona? Share your opinions in the comments. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other equally moving narratives. Each subscription motivates us to continue bringing stories that inspire and touch you. Where are you watching us from? Tell us your city and country in the comments. Your participation is very important to us. Thank you very much for your company, and until the next story.